The morning sunlight streaked across the crowded diner, painting everything in shades of gold. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with sizzling bacon as conversations buzzed around the room. In one corner, a man in his early 30s sat alone at a booth. He was dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, with a well-worn sketchbook open before him. His sharp eyes, lined with weariness, darted across the room, absorbing the energy like an artist capturing life. This was Caleb Lawson. By trade, he was an artist known for his murals across the city. But today, Caleb was cover, working a special assignment for the police force. His task, to investigate reports of a crime ring laundering money through local businesses. No badge, no uniform, just his wits in the guise of an unassuming artist. As he sketched, the bell above the diner door jingled, and in walked a towering man in uniform. Officer Ethan Crowleybird shouldered, clean-shaven, with an air of authority that made the diner's hum falter for a moment. Ethan scanned the room with a gaze that felt more like a searchlight than a glance. His eyes landed on Caleb, and something changed. His expression hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan strode over to the counter and ordered coffee, but his attention didn't waver from Caleb. The artist was oblivious, sir. At least, he seemed to be. As Caleb continued to sketch, Ethan leaned against the counter, watching. Then, loud enough for half the diner to hear, he muttered, "Some people just can't help looking suspicious." Several heads turned, a few eyebrows raised, but Caleb didn't react. He flipped the page in his sketchbook and kept working, his pencil gliding across the paper like a whisper. Ethan's words hung in the air, a storm cloud waiting to burst. Caleb remained focused on his sketch, as though Ethan's comment had vanished into thin air. But the air around him was thick with the tension he pretended not to notice. A waitress hovered near the counter, her eyes darting nervously between Caleb and Officer Crowley. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. Ethan, emboldened by Caleb's lack of response, pushed further. He took his coffee and sauntered toward the artist's booth, his boots thudding heavily against the tile floor. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice tinged with an edge of authority. "What you got there?" Caleb slowly looked up, his expression calm but curious. "Just a sketch," he replied evenly, holding up the pad to show a half-finished drawing of the diner's interior. It was intricate, down to the flecks of light on the coffee cups and the folds in the waitress's apron. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Sketching, huh? You sure you're not?" "I don't know. Casing the place." The words landed like a slap, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Caleb tilted his head, his gaze steady but still void of anger. "Casing the place." He repeated as though the phrase was foreign to him. Ethan crossed his arms, the hint of a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know what I mean. Folks like you loitering, acting suspicious. Maybe I should run your ID." Caleb raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. The waitress took a step closer, her voice tentative. Officer Crowley. Caleb comes in here all the time. He's just an artist." Ethan cut her off with a dismissive wave. "I didn't ask for your opinion, miss." The waitress froze, retreating a step, her cheeks flushed. Caleb, however, set down his pencil and folded his hands neatly on the table. His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate Ethan further. "Go ahead," Caleb said quietly. "Run my ID." Ethan blinked as though surprised by the lack of resistance. The smirk faded into something colder. "You sure about that?" he asked, his tone daring. Caleb didn't flinch. "Absolutely." The officer's lips twisted into a thin smile as he reached for his radio. "Let's see what we've got," he muttered, clearly expecting some kind of incriminating result. But as Ethan moved to take Caleb's wallet, the artist leaned back and said, "You might want to double-check before you do that." Ethan paused, his hand hovering. Caleb's tone wasn't threatening, but it carried a weight that made the officer hesitate. The artist's calm was unnerving, and for the first time, Ethan seemed unsure of himself. The other diners watched silently, their unease growing by the second. Caleb met Ethan's gaze steadily, an almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "Trust me," Caleb said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't want to make that call." Ethan narrowed his eyes at Caleb, clearly weighing his options. The officer's pride was now entangled with the situation, and retreating wasn't part of his plan. Slowly, he pulled out his notepad instead of his radio, flipping it open with exaggerated care. "All right, let's do this the easy way. Name and address." Ethan said, pen poised like a weapon. Caleb remained unruffled, sliding his ID across the table. Ethan snatched it up and examined it, his smirk widening. "Caleb Lawson. That's a pretty common name. You got any priors I should know about Mr. Lawson?" Caleb didn't respond, and Ethan turned to the nearest patron, a middle-aged man clutching his coffee mug tightly. "You seen this guy here before? Ever noticed him doing anything odd?" The man shrank in his seat, shaking his head quickly. "No, sir. He just draws, that's all. Real good, too. Did that mural over by City Hall." Ethan scoffed. "City Hall? I guess criminals have to work somewhere." The waitress, still lingering near the counter, couldn't hold back any more. "Officer Crowley, you've got the wrong idea about Caleb. He's a regular here." Ethan cut her off again, his tone sharp. "Did I ask for a character reference? Stay out of this." Caleb leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. The room had grown so quiet that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed loud. Finally he spoke. "You seem pretty determined to make this into something it's not." Caleb said, his voice calm, deliberate. "Why is that?" Ethan's smirk returned, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "Why? Let's just say I've got a sixth sense for these things. You think I don't know how to spot trouble when I see it?" "Trouble," Caleb repeated as if tasting the word. He let the silence linger, forcing Ethan to fill it. "Look, it's not personal," Ethan added, though the words rang hollow. "Just doing my job, keeping the neighborhood safe." Caleb nodded slowly, his expression still unreadable. "And what does safe look like to you?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "It looks like people who belong here. People who don't stick out." "Stick out?" Caleb echoed, leaning forward slightly. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried an undeniable weight. Like an artist in a diner with a sketch pad, Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he seemed unsure of his footing. Caleb's gaze stayed locked on his, steady and unblinking. "Or maybe," Caleb continued, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear, "it looks like a cop making assumptions about someone because of the color of their skin." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Ethan's jaw tightened, his face flushing. "That's not what this is about," he snapped, though the defensiveness in his tone betrayed him. Caleb leaned back again, his calm unshaken. "If you say so." The waitress took a small step forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Officer, maybe you should let Caleb finish his coffee. He's not bothering anyone." Ethan turned to her, his frustration mounting. "You don't tell me how to do my job, miss." The room had shifted, where there was once hesitation among the patrons. Now there was a quiet solidarity. Eyes narrowed at Ethan's aggressive stance. Whispers of disapproval started to spread. Caleb watched it all unfold, his composure unbroken. His next move would be pivotal, and Ethan had no idea what was coming. The tension in the diner thickened like smoke. Caleb remained composed, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the simmering frustration etched into Ethan's face. The patrons were no longer passive observers. Their expressions ranged from discomfort to outright disapproval. It was clear they were on Caleb's side, even if no one said it aloud. Ethan seemed to notice the shift in the room, but refused to back down. His authority, his ego, was at stake. He flipped Caleb, ID over in his hand, his eyes scanning it as though searching for something incriminating. Finding nothing, he slapped it back onto the table with unnecessary force. "No priors, huh?" Ethan said, his voice dripping with skepticism. Guess today's your lucky day. Caleb reached out and slid the ID back into his wallet with deliberate calm. Lucky, he repeated, as if mulling over the word. He met Ethan's gaze. Is that what you think this is? Ethan ignored the question, his eyes darting to the sketch pad on the table. Without asking, he grabbed it and began flipping through the pages. Each sketch was a masterpiece, cityscapes, portraits, and everyday scenes captured with breathtaking detail. Quite the artist, aren't you? Ethan said, his tone dismissive. He stopped on a page depicting a mural that was unmistakably the one at City Hall, a vibrant portrayal of the city's diverse community. The signature at the bottom read, M. Lawson. Ethan froze for a moment, the realization dawning on him, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. M. Lawson, that's you, he asked, his voice laced with doubt. Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, a quiet challenge. What do you think? Ethan's lips thinned, and he shoved the sketchpad back onto the table. Doesn't change anything. He's a good challenge. What do you think? Ethan's lips thinned, and he shoved the sketchpad back onto the table. Doesn't change anything, he said, his voice tighter now. Doesn't mean you're not up to something. The waitress stepped forward again, her courage bolstered by the shift in the room. Officer, that mural is famous. Caleb painted it. He's one of the most respected artists in the room. Officer, that mural is famous. Caleb painted it. He's one of the most respected artists in the city. Ethan turned on her, his frustration boiling over. I told you to stay out of this. That outburst was the tipping point. A low murmur of disapproval rippled through the diner. A man near the window stood up, his arms crossed. Why don't you leave the guy alone? He's not doing anything wrong. Another voice chimed in. Yeah, he's just sitting there, minding his business. Why are you hassling him? Ethan's face reddened as the tide of the room turned against him. He glanced around, his confidence wavering for the first time. Caleb watched it all unfold, his expression calm but observant. He could see the cracks forming in Ethan's facade, the mounting pressure from the crowd. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the murmurs with precision. It's interesting, isn't it? He said, addressing Ethan directly. How quickly people see through a lie when they're not afraid to look. Ethan's eyes snapped back to Caleb, his anger barely contained. What's that supposed to mean? Caleb didn't flinch. It means that sometimes the harder you try to push something false, the more obvious it becomes to everyone around you. The diner fell silent again, all eyes on Ethan. He was trapped now, his authority crumbling under the weight of his own actions. Caleb could see the conflict in his expression, pride battling with the dawning realization that he had miscalculated. And Caleb wasn't done. The artist's calm resolve was unshakable, and the next move was his to make. Ethan stood rigid, his face a cocktail of frustration, embarrassment, and stubborn pride. The murmurs from the crowd had subsided into a heavy silence, but the weight of their judgment was palpable. He glanced around, his authority visibly cracking under the pressure of so many watchful eyes. Caleb, still seated, exuded an aura of quiet strength. He picked up his pencil again, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and began sketching on a fresh page. The faint scratches of the pencil against paper filled the silence, a sound almost hypnotic in its steadiness. The subtle act was both disarming and defiant, as though Caleb were reclaiming the space that Ethan had tried to dominate. Ethan frowned, unsure of what to do next. "What are you doing now?" he barked, his tone sharper than intended. Caleb didn't look up. "What does it look like?" he replied, his voice sharper than intended. Caleb didn't look up. "What does it look like?" he replied, his voice calm, almost serene. "I'm sketching." Ethan's frustration flared, and he jabbed a finger at the sketch pad. "That's enough. I didn't say you could start drawing again." Caleb stopped, his pencil hovering above the page, and looked up at Ethan with an almost amused expression. "Didn't realize I needed your permission to practice my craft." The remark landed softly, but carried an undeniable sting. A faint chuckle rippled through the diner, the patrons emboldened by Caleb's composure. Ethan's face flushed deeper and his fists clenched at his sides. "You're trying to be a smartass," Ethan growled, "but I'm not here to play games. You're acting suspicious, and I have every right to question you." Caleb leaned back, his posture relaxed, and rested the pencil on the table. Suspicious. He repeated the word, hanging in the air like a challenge. "What's suspicious, officer? The fact that I'm sketching or the fact that I'm a black man in a diner?" The room collectively inhaled. Caleb's words struck like lightning, cutting through Ethan's bluster with surgical precision. Ethan opened his mouth to respond but faltered, the weight of the accusation halting him in his tracks. "I didn't say that," Ethan finally muttered, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "You didn't have to," Caleb replied, his tone calm but unyielding. "Your actions say plenty." Ethan's discomfort was now impossible to ignore. The walls of the diner seemed to close in around him as the eyes of every patron bore into him, their silent judgment growing louder with every second of his hesitation. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make the entire room strain to hear. "You know what's really suspicious, Officer Crowley?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. "Someone who abuses their authority to intimidate people without cause. Someone who can't admit when they're wrong." Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as though he might lash out. But the murmurs around the room started again, louder this time, voices of quiet outrage and solidarity with Caleb. "That's enough," Ethan snapped, his voice trembling with frustration. "You don't get to lecture me." Caleb tilted his head, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "Then maybe it's time someone did." The words hit like a hammer, reverberating through the diner. Ethan visibly recoiled, his bravado crumbling further under the pressure of Caleb's calm yet unflinching resolve. The patrons' murmurs grew louder, and it was clear that Ethan was losing the room entirely. Caleb picked up his pencil again, turning his attention back to the sketch pad. The conversation wasn't over, but the balance of power had shifted. Caleb was in control now, and Ethan was teetering on the edge of a reckoning he hadn't seen coming. Ethan stood there, frozen in place, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. The patrons' murmurs grew louder, emboldened by Caleb's quiet defiance. A woman near the counter folded her arms, her voice cutting through the growing chorus. "Why don't you just leave the man alone?" she said, her tone sharp. "He's not doing anything wrong." "Yeah." Another voice chimed in, this time from an elderly man seated by the window. "We've been coming here for years, and Caleb has always been respectful. You're the only one causing trouble." Ethan's eyes darted around the room, his face a mix of anger and unease. His authority, once unquestioned, now felt like a house of cards ready to collapse under the weight of the diner's collective disapproval. But Caleb wasn't finished. Slowly, he tore a page from his sketchbook and placed it on the table. The sound was deliberate, commanding attention. Then he stood up, his tall frame towering over the booth. His movements were slow, controlled, yet undeniably powerful. "Officer Crowley," Caleb said, his voice firm but calm, "if you're so convinced I'm a threat, why don't you arrest me? Go ahead. Do it here in front of all these witnesses. Let's see how that goes for you." The challenge was bold, and the room fell silent. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what Ethan would do. His face turned crimson, his frustration mounting with every passing second. "You think you're clever," Ethan sneered, but the quiver in his voice betrayed him. "You think you can turn these people against me." Caleb took a step closer, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I don't need to turn anyone against you, officer," he said. "You're doing that all by yourself." Ethan flinched as if the words were a physical blow. The weight of the crowd's judgment pressed down on him, the collective gaze of the patrons a mirror reflecting his worst instincts back at him. Then Caleb did something unexpected. He slid the torn page from his sketchbook across the table toward Ethan. "Here," he said simply. Ethan frowned, hesitating before picking up the page. It was a sketch of the diner, but this one was different. The details were sharper, the scene almost alive. The focus of the drawing wasn't the room itself, but a figure. Officer Crowley standing tall and imposing, his hand on his hip, staring down at an artist seated at a booth. The expression on the figure's face was unmistakable arrogance, distrust, and misplaced authority etched into every line. The room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan stared at the drawing. The accuracy was undeniable, the image a stark reflection of the very moment they were all living. For the first time, Ethan looked unsure of himself, his bravado cracking under the weight of Caleb artistry. "You're good at making judgments," Caleb said softly, breaking the silence. "So tell me, office, what does this look like to you?" Ethan didn't respond. His hand trembled slightly as he set the drawing down. The other patrons leaned in, craning their necks to see the sketch that had so clearly struck a nerve. Caleb sat back down, picking up his pencil again, as if nothing had happened. "Take your time," he said, his tone calm but pointed. "I've got all day." The room buzzed with whispered commentary. Ethan's face was a storm of emotions, embarrassment, anger, and a creeping realization he couldn't quite suppress. His authority had been challenged in a way he wasn't prepared for, and the crowd was waiting to see how he would respond. But the game had shifted entirely. Caleb was no longer the subject of Ethan's scrutiny. Now, it was the officer himself under the magnifying glass. His actions laid bare for all to see. Ethan's face was a turbulent canvas of emotions, anger warring with shame, confusion battling the stubbornness etched into his very being. He gripped the sketch tightly, his knuckles whitening as if trying to crush the truth it displayed. The patrons watched, their eyes sharp and expectant, waiting for the officer's next move. Caleb's calm demeanor only seemed to heighten the tension. He continued sketching, the soft scratch of pencil against paper a deliberate reminder of his focus and control. He didn't need to say anything more. The weight of the situation spoke for itself. "Nice drawing," Ethan finally muttered, his voice low and bitter. "Too bad it doesn't mean anything." Caleb stopped mid-stroke, his pencil poised in the air. Slowly he looked up at Ethan, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if observing an interesting but unimportant detail. "Doesn't mean anything," Caleb echoed, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the whole diner could hear. "Funny, I thought I was supposed to reflect the truth." Ethan's jaw tightened, his grip on the paper loosening slightly. The sketch, so detailed, so raw, had clearly struck a nerve. The patrons were leaning in now, their interest no longer passive but engaged. It was as though Caleb had invited them all into his world, using his art to tell the story Ethan was so desperately trying to deny. A teenager sitting with his parents near the counter spoke up, his voice clear and confident. "That sketch looks exactly like what's happening right now. Even the way you're standing, it's kind of scary how accurate it is." Ethan shot the boy a glare, but the teen didn't flinch. Instead, he glanced at Caleb, admiration in his eyes. "You're really talented," he added. Caleb offered a small nod of thanks, but kept his gaze on Ethan. "Art doesn't lie, officer," he said, his tone calm yet unyielding. "It's just a mirror. If you don't like what you see, maybe the problem isn't the art." The room seemed to shift, the power dynamic tilting further in Caleb's favor. Ethan looked around, realizing the crowd wasn't just watching, they were judging. The disapproving murmurs grew louder, a rising tide of voices questioning his actions. "You've made your point," Ethan snapped, his voice strained. "Maybe you think you're clever, but I've got nothing to apologize for. I'm doing my job." "Your job," Caleb repeated, raising an eyebrow. He set his pencil down again, folding his hands on the table. "Tell me, officer, how exactly is harassing an innocent man in a diner part of your job?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, the words dying in his throat. Caleb didn't let the silence linger. "Because from where I'm sitting," Caleb continued, his voice calm but firm, "it looks like you came in here looking for a problem. And when you didn't find one, you tried to create one. Why is that, officer? Is it the sketch pad? Or is it the fact that I don't look like I belong here to you?" The directness of the question hung heavy in the air. Ethan visibly bristled, but the weight of the crowd's gaze pinned him in place. The patrons weren't just watching me, were waiting for an answer. A woman seated near the front, her arms crossed, added to the pressure. We've all seen what's happening here. You don't need to explain it, Caleb, he does. She gestured pointedly at Ethan. Ethan's face reddened, his eyes darting from Caleb to the woman and back again. The judgment in the room was suffocating, and for the first time, Ethan seemed to realize he was no longer in control. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. So, officer, what's it going to be? Are you going to keep digging yourself deeper? Or are you going to take a moment to reflect on what this really says about you? Ethan's lips parted, but no sound came out. He was at a crossroads, and everyone in the room could see it. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. Caleb didn't push further. He didn't need to. The room, and the truth, was doing the work for him. The crowd waited, holding their collective breath for what came next. The officer, once so certain of his authority, now stood like a man with no ground left to stand on. Ethan's breath quickened, his face a vivid shade of crimson as the weight of the room bore down on him. The patrons weren't just on Caleb. Side there were witnesses, an audience that had seen through the flimsy veil of authority he had tried to wrap himself in. The sketch in his hand felt heavier than any report he had ever written, its stark truth impossible to ignore. Caleb sat back, arms crossed, his calm demeanor unshaken. He didn't press the issue further, letting the silence stretch, letting Ethan stew in the uncomfortable realization that this situation was of his own making. Look, Ethan finally said, his voice strained, the bravado from earlier replaced with a feeble attempt at justification. Maybe I was a little overzealous. I was just doing my job. Your job. Caleb repeated softly, the phrase an echo laced with quiet power. What exactly does your job require you to do, officer? Intimidate innocent people, make snap judgments based on how they look. Ethan flinched at the words, his eyes darting to the sketch in his hand. He couldn't bring himself to look directly at Caleb. Instead, he muttered, I'm not racist, all right. That's not what this is about. Caleb tilted his head, his gaze steady and sharp. Not racist, he said, his tone thoughtful, measured. And yet here we are. The patrons murmured their agreement, the air in the diner thick with quiet outrage. The woman near the counter spoke up again, her voice clear and firm. If you're not racist, officer, then why did you single him out? He wasn't bothering anyone. He's here all the time, but the second you walked in, you zeroed in on him like he was a criminal. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The teenager near the counter chimed in, emboldened by the shifting tide. You literally said he looked suspicious. How? Because he's drawing or because he's black? Ethan's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the scrutiny visibly wearing him down. He was cornered and he knew it, but instead of admitting fault, he doubled down, his voice rising defensively. Look, I have a responsibility to keep this neighborhood safe. Ethan snapped. I can't just ignore someone who might be a threat. A threat, Caleb said, his voice still calm but cutting. He gestured to the sketch pad on the table. What about me says threat to you, officer? Is it the pencil, the paper, or is it something else entirely? Ethan hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The crowd watched, their collective judgment palpable. The elderly man by the window leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with disappointment. You know the answer to that, son, and so does everyone else in this room. Ethan's composure cracked further, the flimsy walls of his justification collapsing around him. He clenched his fists, the tension in his body radiating outward like a coiled spring. Caleb, ever the portrait of calm, leaned forward slightly. His voice softened, but it carried the weight of everything that had transpired. The thing about authority, Officer Crowley, is that it comes with responsibility. Responsibility to act with integrity, to treat people with respect, to admit when you're wrong. Ethan's face twitched, the words cutting through his defenses like a blade. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the faces around him. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were waiting for him to face the truth. Caleb didn't press further. He didn't need to. The truth was already in the open, raw and undeniable. Ethan was teetering on the edge of a decision, and the entire diner waited to see which way he would fall. Ethan's shoulders sagged under the weight of his own actions, his gaze dropping to the sketch he still clutched in his hand. The stark image of himself, drawn with an unflinching honesty that stripped away every pretense, was impossible to look at for long. Yet he couldn't let it go, as though the paper itself was holding him accountable in a way he couldn't escape. Crowd in the diner remained quiet, but the silence was heavy, pressing. No one looked away. Every eye was fixed on him, their judgment unspoken but undeniable. Caleb finally broke the silence, his voice softer now, but no less resolute. You don't have to dig yourself in deeper, officer. You can stop right here. It's not too late. Ethan's head snapped up, his pride momentarily flaring. Stop what? I didn't, he caught himself, the defensive words dying on his lips. He glanced around the room again at the faces of the patrons who had seen everything. The usual shield of his badge felt distant and flimsy under their collective gaze. Caleb leaned forward, his tone measured and deliberate. We all make mistakes, Ethan. The difference between a good man and a bully is what you do after you realize you're wrong. Ethan flinched at the word bully, but there was no venom in Caleb's tone. If anything, his calm made the statement cut even deeper. Ethan looked back down at the sketch, his face a mixture of shame, anger, and something else, something that might have been reflection. The teenage boy near the counter broke the silence. It's okay to admit you messed up. Everybody messes up. It's how you fix it that matters. Ethan's grip on the sketch tightened, the edges crumpling under his fingers. For a moment he looked like he might lash out, the stubbornness in his expression refusing to let go. But then his shoulders slumped further, and his face softened ever so slightly. He set the sketch on the table, smoothing out the creased edges with his palm. All right, he said finally, his voice quieter now. Maybe I came on too strong. Maybe I jumped to conclusions I shouldn't have. The tension in the room shifted. The crowd didn't erupt into applause or forgiveness, but their collective gaze softened, the pressure easing just slightly. It wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledged, meant to step in the right direction. Caleb nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. That's a start, he said, his voice steady, but words aren't enough. Actions matter more. Ethan's jaw tightened again, but this time it wasn't with defensiveness. It was the look of a man grappling with the weight of his own shortcomings. He nodded stiffly, not trusting himself to say more. Caleb picked up his pencil again, returning to his sketch pad as though the situation had been resolved. But the room was still charged with anticipation. The crowd wasn't quite ready to let Ethan off the hook. The elderly man by the window spoke up again, his voice calm but firm. You've got a lot to think about, son, and a lot to make right. Don't waste this moment. Ethan didn't respond. He nodded once more, then turned on his heel and walked toward the door. The bell jingled as he pushed it open, and he paused for a brief moment on the threshold. Without looking back, he muttered, "Have a good day," before stepping out into the sunlight. The tension in the room lingered for a moment longer, like the echo of a storm that had just passed. Then, slowly, conversations resumed, the hum of the diner returning to life. Caleb stayed seated, his pencil gliding over the page. He was already sketching again, his focus unwavering. But there was a quiet strength in his posture, a subtle but undeniable victory that radiated outward. The fight wasn't over by a long shot, but today he had won, and everyone in the room knew it. Outside the diner the sun shone brightly, the world carrying on as if shot, but today he had won, and everyone in the room knew it. Outside the diner, the sun shone brightly, the world carrying on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Caleb continued sketching, his movements fluid and calm, as if nothing could disrupt his focus. But the truth was, he wasn't drawing for himself anymore. He was documenting the moment, ensuring its impact would last beyond the walls of the small diner. The teenage boy approached Caleb's table, his hands tucked nervously into his pockets. "That was amazing," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "The way you stayed calm, even when he was so wrong. How'd you do that?" Caleb looked up, offering the boy a faint smile. "Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay quiet," he said simply. "People show you who they are if you let them. The trick is knowing when to speak and when to listen." The boy nodded thoughtfully, his admiration evident. "Do you think you'll change?" he asked, glancing toward the door where Ethan had left moments earlier. Caleb's pencil paused for a moment, his eyes distant. "Maybe," he said. "That depends on him. But the important thing is that he's got no excuse not to. He's seen the truth now, whether he wanted to or not." The boy nodded again, seeming to file the wisdom away for future use. "Thanks," he said, before retreating back to his table. The waitress, who had been hovering nearby, finally worked up the courage to approach. She set a fresh cup of coffee in front of Caleb and smiled shyly. "That one's on the house," she said softly. Caleb looked up, his expression warm but curious. "You don't have to do that," he said. She shook her head. "After what you just did, it's the least I can do. People like you, you give the rest of us hope." Caleb smiled, a small but genuine expression of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, lifting the cup in a silent toast before taking a sip. As the hum of the diner resumed, the patrons began to reflect quietly among themselves. Conversations turned to topics of fairness, justice, and the subtle ways prejudice could seep into everyday life. The incident with Officer Crowley had sparked something in awareness, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Outside, Ethan sat in his patrol car, staring at the crumpled sketch in his hands. His jaw clenched as he smoothed out the paper, the image staring back at him with an honesty he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, he felt small not because of the crowd or even Caleb, but because of himself. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The world outside his car seemed different somehow, sharper and more vivid, like he was seeing it clearly for the first time. He didn't know if he could change, didn't know if he was ready to bat. The seed had been planted, and its roots were already starting to grow. Back in the diner, Caleb continued sketching, the lines on his page capturing not just the scene around him, but the essence of what had transpired. He didn't need to look up to feel the shift in the room, quiet solidarity, the unspoken understanding that something important had just happened. Caleb knew the road ahead was long, and moments like these were just small victories in a larger fight. But as he finished the last line of his new drawing, a depiction of the diners united in quiet strength, allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The fight wasn't over, but today, justice had taken one small step forward, and sometimes that was enough.